Tonight, we'll take you on another quiet journey through time, into one of history's more brutal chapters, told gently so your mind can rest while the past unfolds. When we last left you, Achilles, your carefully maintained disguise as Princess Pyrrha, had been spectacularly demolished by Odysseus and his cunningly placed sword. You'd said goodbye to Deidamia and baby Neoptolemus, sailed to Aulis, and joined the massive Greek army preparing for the greatest war in history. So here you are, at Aulis, officially part of the most ambitious military expedition ever assembled, and already discovering that being a legendary hero comes with complications nobody mentioned during your centaur education. Your integration into this massive war machine has been surprisingly smooth, all things considered. The other commanders treat you with the respectful wariness of people who've heard impressive stories and aren't entirely sure which parts to believe. Your myrmidons have accepted you as their leader with the enthusiasm of professional soldiers who appreciate having someone competent in charge. And Patroclus has proven to be exactly the kind of friend you didn't know you needed. But the transition from hidden princess to celebrated warrior hasn't been without its awkward moments. For one thing, you keep catching yourself moving with feminine grace instead of masculine confidence, a habit that draws curious looks from soldiers who've never seen a hero who occasionally forgets how to walk like a man. For another, you have a tendency to comment on the quality of the camp's textile arrangements, which isn't exactly the sort of expertise that enhances your reputation for martial prowess. Most embarrassing of all, you sometimes respond to Pyrrha before remembering that you're supposed to be Achilles now. It's particularly awkward when it happens during military briefings, where strategic discussions about siege tactics shouldn't be interrupted by heroes having identity confusion. The worst incident occurred during a planning session about Troy's defences, when Ajax asked if anyone knew about the eastern approaches. You immediately replied, "Oh yes, I heard the other girls talking about," before catching yourself mid-sentence. The resulting silence was so profound you could have heard a sandal drop. Ajax spent the next 10 minutes staring at you like you'd grown a second head, while Odysseus developed a sudden and intense interest in his maps. "You'll get used to it," Patroclus assures you one evening as you sit by your campfire, watching the flames dance while 1,000 other fires flicker across the camp like fallen stars. Everyone needs time to adjust to their real identity after spending months pretending to be someone else. The weight of reputation presses down on you like invisible armor, heavier than bronze and impossible to remove. Every conversation carries the subtext of your legendary status. Every action is measured against stories people have heard about your supernatural abilities. Every decision is evaluated through the lens of whether it's appropriately heroic. The burden of living up to your own mythology, Odysseus observes one morning when he finds you practicing sword forms with unusual intensity. It's heavier than most people expect. "Is it always like this?" you ask, pausing mid-strike to look at the man who'd revealed your true nature with such clever efficiency. The attention? The expectations? Odysseus considers the question seriously. The brightest flames, after all, burn the fastest, but they are also the ones everyone remembers. There's something in his tone that suggests personal experience with this process, and you find yourself wondering what it's like to be famous enough that everyone expects solutions, but human enough to occasionally fail anyway. But such philosophical discussions are interrupted by the arrival of new orders. The winds have shifted, the omens are favourable, and the fleet is finally ready to sail toward Troy. The long-awaited departure brings excitement and relief in equal measure, mixed with the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing you're about to undertake something unprecedented. The voyage begins with the kind of organised chaos that characterises large military operations. 1,000 ships don't move in perfect formation, no matter how carefully the departure is planned. Vessels separate and rejoin, signals are misunderstood, and navigation becomes an ongoing exercise in collective problem-solving. Which is how, several days into the journey, you find yourself approaching a coastline that definitely doesn't match anyone's description of Troy. "Are we sure this is right?" someone asks, though the question carries more hope than confidence. The answer, as it turns out, is definitively no. But when you're commanding 1,000 ships filled with eager warriors, admitting navigational errors becomes politically complicated. Better to treat this as an intentional stop, than acknowledge that the greatest military expedition in history has gotten lost on its way to war. Strategic reconnaissance, Agamemnon declares with the kind of confidence that suggests he's been practicing this explanation. We're gathering intelligence about local defences. By attacking them, someone asks. Precisely, very thorough intelligence gathering. It's the sort of military logic that sounds almost reasonable until you think about it for more than 3 seconds. Because nothing says we're ready for the most famous siege in history, like accidentally sailing to the wrong country and having to pretend it was always part of the plan. The next morning brings news that transforms the entire army from a collection of restless warriors into a focused war machine. The winds have finally shifted in their favour, the omens are promising, and the fleet is ready to sail toward Troy. After weeks of waiting at Aulis, the moment everyone has been preparing for has finally arrived. Your integration into this massive military enterprise has been surprisingly smooth, all things considered. The other commanders treat you with the respectful wariness of people who've heard impressive stories and aren't entirely sure which parts to believe. Your myrmidons have accepted you as their leader with the enthusiasm of professional soldiers who appreciate having someone competent in charge. But the transition from hidden princess to celebrated warrior hasn't been without its awkward moments. For one thing, you keep catching yourself moving with feminine grace instead of masculine confidence, a habit that draws curious looks from soldiers who've never seen a hero, who occasionally forgets how to walk like a man. For another, you have a tendency to comment on the quality of the camp's textile arrangements, which isn't exactly the sort of expertise that enhances your reputation for martial prowess. Most embarrassing of all, you sometimes respond to Pyrrha before remembering that you're supposed to be Achilles now. It's particularly awkward when it happens during military briefings, where strategic discussions about siege tactics shouldn't be interrupted by heroes having identity confusion. You'll get used to it, Patroclus assures you one evening as you sit by your campfire, watching the flames dance while 1,000 other fires flicker across the camp like fallen stars. Everyone needs time to adjust to their real identity after spending months pretending to be someone else. Have you ever spent months disguised as a woman, you ask, genuinely curious about whether this sort of experience is more common among heroes than you'd assume? No, he admits, but I once spent a winter pretending to be a merchant so I could spy on some cattle raiders. By the time spring came, I was so used to discussing profit margins that I kept trying to negotiate bulk discounts with our weapon suppliers. It's a comforting story, and Patroclus tells it with the kind of easy humour that makes you understand why friendship with him feels so natural. There's something about his presence that reminds you of the peaceful domesticity you left behind on Scyros. Not in a way that makes you homesick exactly, but in a way that makes the military camp feel less foreign. The weight of reputation presses down on you like invisible armour, heavier than bronze and impossible to remove. Every conversation carries the subtext of your legendary status. Every action is measured against stories people have heard about your supernatural abilities. Every decision is evaluated through the lens of whether it's appropriately heroic. The burden of living up to your own mythology, Odysseus observes one morning when he finds you practicing sword forms with unusual intensity. It's heavier than most people expect. Is it always like this, you ask, pausing mid-strike to look at the man who'd revealed your true nature with such clever efficiency? The attention, the expectations? Odysseus considers the question seriously. It depends on how legendary you become. Some heroes peak early and then spend the rest of their careers trying to recapture past glory. Others grow into their reputations gradually, and a few... He trails off, studying your expression with those calculating eyes that seem to see more than they should. A few, you prompt? A few become so legendary that they transcend their own humanity. They stop being people and become symbols, stories, cautionary tales. His gaze lingers on you with something that might be sympathy. The brightest flames, after all, burn the fastest, but they're also the ones everyone remembers. There's something in his tone that suggests personal experience with this process, and you find yourself wondering what it's like to be Odysseus, clever enough to solve any problem, famous enough that everyone expects solutions, but human enough to occasionally fail anyway. But such philosophical discussions are interrupted by the arrival of new orders. The winds have shifted, the omens are favourable, and the fleet is finally ready to sail toward Troy. The long-awaited departure brings excitement and relief in equal measure, mixed with the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing you're about to undertake something unprecedented. The voyage begins with the kind of organized chaos that characterizes large military operations. 1,000 ships don't move in perfect formation, no matter how carefully the departure is planned. Vessels separate and rejoin, signals are misunderstood, and navigation becomes an ongoing exercise in collective problem-solving. Which is how, several days into the journey, you find yourself approaching a coastline that definitely doesn't match anyone's description of Troy. "Are we sure this is right?" someone asks, though the question is more hopeful than confident. The answer, as it turns out, is definitively no. But when you're commanding 1,000 ships filled with eager warriors, admitting navigational errors becomes politically complicated. Better to treat this as an intentional stop than acknowledge that the greatest military expedition in history has gotten lost on its way to war. Because nothing says we're ready for the most famous siege in history like accidentally sailing to the wrong country and having to pretend it was always part of the plan. What follows is your first lesson in the gap between theoretical military planning and practical military reality. The coastline you're approaching belongs to Mysia, ruled by King Telephus, who has the unfortunate timing to be defending his homeland, just when 1,000 confused Greek ships decide they need somewhere to land. The landing doesn't go smoothly, which should have been everyone's first clue that this might not be the glorious campaign they'd envisioned. The Mysians, understandably confused about why the entire Greek expeditionary force has suddenly appeared on their horizon, decide that the appropriate response is vigorous self-defense. King Telephus leads the resistance personally. He's everything a proper Bronze Age monarch should be: tall, strong, brave to the point of recklessness, and absolutely committed to preventing foreign armies from casually invading his kingdom. The kind of man who makes excellent allies and terrible enemies. Unfortunately, he's chosen to be your enemy today. The battle that follows is your first real taste of warfare, and it's educational. Training with Chiron was comprehensive, but fighting actual soldiers who are actually trying to kill you introduces variables that practice never quite captures. The noise, for instance, the clash of bronze on bronze, the shouts of men, the screams of the wounded, the smell of blood and sweat and fear, the way time seems to move differently when someone is trying to separate your head from your shoulders. But you adapt quickly, because adaptation is what you were trained for. Your spear finds its targets, your sword cuts where you aim it, and gradually you begin to understand why prophecies were written about you. You're not just skilled, you're something beyond skill, something that approaches the supernatural, which is how you end up face to face with King Telephus himself, two warriors meeting in the chaos of battle while their armies clash around them. He's good, better than good actually. He moves with the fluid grace of someone who's been fighting since he could hold a weapon, and his technique shows the kind of refinement that comes from years of combat experience. In any normal circumstances, he'd be a formidable opponent. But these aren't normal circumstances, and you aren't a normal warrior. The fight is brief but memorable. Telephus attacks with all the skill and fury of a king defending his homeland, but your spear finds him anyway. The bronze point takes him in the thigh, and suddenly the tide of battle shifts as dramatically as if someone had flipped a cosmic switch. Telephus goes down hard, blood flowing freely from a wound that looks disturbingly serious. His men, seeing their king fall, begin to fall back toward their fortified positions. The Greeks, seeing victory within their grasp, press forward with renewed enthusiasm. It should be a moment of triumph, your first real battle, your first royal opponent, your first taste of the glory that everyone keeps insisting is your destiny. Instead, you find yourself looking down at the wounded king and feeling complicated. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this. Not here. Not to someone who was just defending his own territory against foreign invaders. Telephus wasn't your enemy by choice. He was your enemy by accident, by circumstance, by the simple misfortune of being in the wrong place when 1,000 Greek ships decided to make an unscheduled stop. But the moment passes, the battle continues, and soon the Mysians are in full retreat. The Greeks hold the beach, the immediate threat is neutralized, and everyone begins the process of figuring out what to do next. That's when someone notices that the wound you inflicted on Telephus isn't healing properly. At all, actually. The bleeding won't stop, the flesh won't knit, and the king, who should be recovering from what appeared to be a relatively straightforward spear thrust, is instead growing weaker by the hour. Must have hit something important, Ajax observes with the casual indifference of someone who's inflicted plenty of serious wounds himself. But you're beginning to suspect it's more complicated than that. There's something about the way the wound looks, something about the way it refuses to respond to conventional treatment, that suggests forces beyond simple anatomy are at work. The retreat from Mysia is conducted with as much dignity as possible under the circumstances, which is to say very little. Nothing quite says military excellence like accidentally invading an innocent neighbour and then leaving their king bleeding from an apparently incurable wound. But such is the nature of heroic enterprises. They rarely go according to plan, and they almost always leave a trail of unintended consequences in their wake. As your ship pulls away from the Mysian coast, you stand at the rail, watching the shoreline recede. Somewhere behind you, King Telephus lies in his palace, suffering from a wound that won't heal because you inflicted it with a divinely enhanced weapon. It's your first real lesson in the weight of being legendary. Sometimes your actions carry consequences that extend far beyond what you intended. Sometimes being blessed by the gods means that even your accidents become matters of cosmic significance. Because nothing says glorious military campaign like starting a war with the wrong country and leaving their king mysteriously dying from your spear wound. At this rate, you'll have cursed half the Mediterranean before you even reach Troy. Time, as it turns out, is both the cruelest and most necessary medicine. Months pass, and news travels the way news always does in the ancient world. Slowly, unreliably, and with a tendency to become more dramatic with each retelling. The story of your encounter with King Telephus grows in the telling, as such stories do, until you're not sure if you wounded a king or accidentally started a minor apocalypse. The truth, when it finally reaches you, is both simpler and more complicated than the rumours suggested. Telephus isn't dead. This is good news, relatively speaking, since having the blood of an innocent king on your hands would have complicated your already substantial collection of divine entanglements. But he isn't exactly alive and well either, which brings us to the complicated part. The wound you inflicted has become something beyond medical understanding. It won't heal, won't worsen, won't respond to any treatment the finest physicians in Mysia can devise. It simply exists, a permanent reminder of divine intervention in mortal affairs, bleeding just enough to ensure that Telephus remains weak, but not enough to actually kill him. It's the sort of cosmic joke that the gods seem to specialize in, cruel enough to cause suffering, but not quite cruel enough to provide the mercy of ending that suffering. The news reaches you through the complex network of merchants, diplomats, and professional gossips who keep the Mediterranean world informed about itself. A trader from Rhodes mentions hearing about a cursed king in Mysia. A diplomat from Crete confirms the story with additional details about failed healing attempts. A bard from Lesbos turns it into a song that makes you sound considerably more villainous than you feel comfortable with. But it's Odysseus who brings you the most interesting piece of information. An oracle has been consulted about Telephus's condition, and the divine response was both typically cryptic and frustratingly specific. The wound can only be healed by the one who caused it, Odysseus reports, settling down beside your campfire with the satisfied expression of someone who's just delivered a particularly choice piece of gossip. You stare at him across the flames, hoping you've misunderstood something crucial about this statement. Meaning what, exactly? Meaning you, apparently. The oracle was quite clear. Only Achilles can heal the wound that Achilles inflicted. Divine logic at its finest. It's the kind of mystical pronouncement that sounds profound until you actually think about it, at which point it becomes mainly irritating. The gods, it seems, have decided that your accidental invasion of Mysia wasn't quite finished yet. And how exactly am I supposed to heal a divinely cursed wound, you ask, though you suspect the answer will be either completely obvious or utterly impossible. Odysseus shrugs with the casual indifference of someone who's dealt with enough oracles to know that divine instructions rarely come with helpful user manuals. The oracle didn't specify, but I imagine it involves going back to Mysia and trying various things until something works. This is not how you'd planned to spend your time during the war preparations. You'd envisioned training with your myrmidons, perhaps participating in some strategic planning sessions, maybe learning more about Troy's defences. You had not anticipated making house calls to heal kings you'd accidentally cursed. The journey gives you time to consider the various ways this healing attempt could go wrong. You could fail entirely, leaving Telephus worse off than before. You could succeed but trigger some new divine curse in the process. You could heal him perfectly, but discover that the whole thing was an elaborate trap designed to capture you for reasons you haven't thought of yet. Bronze Age heroics, you're learning, involve a lot more anxiety than the songs suggest. Mysia looks different when you're not actively invading it. The coastline is peaceful, the harbours are busy with normal commercial traffic, and the general atmosphere is one of prosperity rather than desperate military resistance. It's actually quite pleasant, which makes you feel even worse about having attacked it in the first place. Telephus receives you in his palace with the gracious dignity of someone who's had months to come to terms with his situation. He's noticeably thinner than when you last saw him, pale in the way that comes from chronic pain and lost blood, but his eyes are still clear and his voice is still strong. Achilles, he says, and his tone carries no accusation, only a kind of resigned amusement. I hear you've come to fix what you broke. If I can, you reply, because honesty seems like the appropriate approach when dealing with someone whose suffering you've caused. I have to admit, divine healing wasn't covered in my education. Chiron didn't include mysterious wound treatment in your curriculum, Telephus asks, and you're surprised to discover he's well informed about your background. Chiron taught me how to cause wounds, not cure impossible ones, you admit. This is somewhat outside my area of expertise. But you try anyway, because divine commands don't typically come with escape clauses for insufficient training. Your first attempt involves examining the wound itself, hoping that close inspection might reveal some obvious solution that Mysia's physicians have overlooked. What you find is disturbing. The spear thrust has left a wound that looks fresh despite being months old, edges that refuse to knit together, flesh that seems to exist in a state of perpetual damage. It's clearly not a normal injury. Normal injuries follow predictable patterns. They heal or they fester, they improve or they worsen. This wound simply is, as if it's been frozen at the moment of impact and preserved in that state by forces beyond human understanding. Because apparently even your accidents come with divine warranties. Have you tried the usual methods? You ask Telephus's chief physician, a competent-looking man who has the slightly desperate expression of someone who's exhausted every treatment in his considerable repertoire. Everything, he confirms. Herbs, prayers, sacrifices, binding spells, healing potions from Egyptian traders. Nothing has any effect whatsoever. So you try the obvious solution. If the wound was caused by your spear, perhaps your spear can heal it as well. Divine logic operates on principles of symmetry and symbolic resonance, so there's a certain cosmic sense to the approach. Unfortunately, cosmic sense and practical results don't always align. You place the bronze point against the wound's edge, hoping for some kind of mystical connection, some flow of healing energy that will reverse what was done. Instead, nothing happens. The spear remains a spear, the wound remains a wound, and everyone in the room looks politely disappointed. Your second attempt involves prayer, because when dealing with divine curses, appealing to the gods who created them seems like reasonable protocol. You make offerings to Apollo, god of healing. You petition Asclepius, patron of physicians. You even try Athena, on the theory that wisdom might succeed where direct intervention has failed. The gods, characteristically, remain silent. Apparently, divine customer service doesn't include technical support for accidental cursing incidents. Your third attempt is more creative. If divine magic created the problem, perhaps divine magic can solve it. You scrape rust from your spear point, rust that has been touched by your divine blood, enhanced by your supernatural nature, and mix it with wine to create a potion that is either brilliantly inspired or completely ridiculous. You want me to drink rust? Telephus asks, examining the mixture with the expression of someone who's been presented with a very dubious-looking medical treatment. Rust from a divinely enhanced weapon, you clarify, as if this makes the proposition significantly more appealing. Mixed with good wine. Very good wine, actually. I may have overcompensated for the rust factor. Telephus swirls the concoction thoughtfully. Well, I suppose I've tried everything else, and at least if this kills me, it'll be the strangest death in recorded history. Telephus drinks it without complaint, because kings who are slowly dying from mystical wounds tend to be open to creative medical solutions. For a moment, everyone holds their breath, waiting to see if this improvised treatment will succeed where conventional medicine has failed. The wound begins to close. It's not dramatic, no flash of light, no divine trumpets, no visible manifestation of supernatural forces. The edges of the wound simply begin to grow together, slowly but perceptibly, like a normal injury finally allowed to follow its natural course. Within hours, the bleeding stops. Within days, the flesh knits together properly. Within a week, Telephus is back on his feet, weak from months of enforced inactivity, but otherwise completely recovered. The cure, it turns out, was literally written into the problem: rust from the weapon that caused the wound, diluted in wine and consumed by the victim. Simple, elegant, and utterly impossible to guess without divine guidance. It's the sort of solution that makes perfect sense in retrospect, and absolutely no sense at all when you're trying to figure it out. "How did you know?" Telephus asks, when he's strong enough to hold a proper conversation. "I didn't," you admit. "I just kept trying things until something worked." Apparently, divine problem-solving involves a lot more trial and error than the poets suggest. But there's something else in his expression now. Something that suggests this encounter has created obligations that extend beyond simple medical treatment. "I owe you a debt," he says finally. "Not just for healing me, but for the reminder that enemies can become allies when circumstances change." And that's when you realize that this whole complicated episode might have been about more than just healing a mystical wound. Sometimes divine interventions serve multiple purposes, creating connections that will prove important later, establishing relationships that will matter when the real crisis arrives. Because nothing says efficient cosmic planning like forcing you to accidentally wound someone so you can later heal them and gain a useful ally for the war you're actually supposed to be fighting. Fresh from your successful career as an accidental healer, you rejoin the Greek fleet with a renewed sense of confidence in your ability to handle whatever complications the gods might throw your way. This optimism, as it turns out, is somewhat premature. The army has used your absence to make actual progress toward your original destination, which means you're finally, actually, heading toward Troy. The mood in the fleet is lighter now. There's something satisfying about sailing in the right direction, even if it took an embarrassing detour through the wrong war to get there. But the gods, as you're learning, have a talent for introducing complications just when things seem to be going smoothly. The warning comes from Thetis herself, your divine mother, who appears to you in a dream with the kind of urgent intensity that suggests this isn't a casual maternal visit. She looks worried, which is concerning because sea goddesses don't typically worry about things that mortal heroes can handle on their own. "There's something you need to know," she says, and her voice carries the weight of prophecy and maternal anxiety in equal measure. "About where you're going, about what you might encounter." Dreams involving divine relatives are never simple affairs. They tend to be heavy with symbolism, loaded with cryptic warnings, and generally designed to leave you more confused than enlightened. But Thetis, to her credit, is being refreshingly direct. "King Tenes rules the island of Tenedos," she continues, her expression growing more serious with each word. "Your fleet will pass his shores on the way to Troy. Under no circumstances, and I cannot stress this enough, are you to harm him. This seems reasonable enough. You're not in the habit of randomly attacking island kings anyway, and after the complications with Telephus, you're perfectly happy to avoid unnecessary conflicts with local rulers." "Why?" you ask. "Because, when divine parents issue specific warnings, there's usually an excellent reason that you'll want to know about before you accidentally violate their instructions." "Because," Thetis says with the patient tone of someone explaining something very important to someone who has a documented history of not listening to important explanations, "he is your cousin, Apollo's grandson to be precise, and Apollo takes a very dim view of family members being killed by other family members regardless of the circumstances." "Ah, divine family politics. You should have guessed." "I'll be careful, you promise, though even as you say it, you're aware that your track record with avoiding unintended violence is less than stellar. See that you are, Thetis replies, and her tone suggests that this isn't merely good advice, but a direct divine command, with consequences you'd rather not contemplate. Apollo's anger is not something you want to experience personally. The dream fades, leaving you with the kind of specific, actionable guidance that divine warnings rarely provide. Don't kill King Tenes. Simple, clear, impossible to misinterpret. Even you should be able to follow an instruction that straightforward. This confidence lasts exactly as long as it takes for the Greek fleet to reach Tenedos. The island is small but prosperous, strategically located along the shipping routes that connect the Aegean to the wider world. Its harbours are well maintained, its fortifications are substantial, and its king has apparently decided that allowing 1,000 Greek warships to pass unmolested might not be in his best interests. King Tenes, when he appears to negotiate with the Greek commanders, is everything you'd expect from Apollo's grandson. Tall, golden-haired, beautiful in the way that suggests divine bloodlines, and possessed of the kind of presence that makes people pay attention when he speaks. He's also young, perhaps your own age, with the kind of idealistic bearing that suggests he takes his royal responsibilities seriously. The negotiation, such as it is, doesn't go well. Agamemnon demands passage rights, resupply privileges, and tribute in the form of gold, food, and whatever else catches his fancy. It's the sort of diplomatic approach that works well when you're dealing with people who can't afford to refuse your requests. Tenes unfortunately appears to be one of those annoying rulers who places principle above pragmatism. Tenedos is a free island, he declares, with the kind of ringing conviction that sounds magnificent in epic poetry and tends to cause practical problems in real-world politics. We owe no tribute to foreign kings, no matter how many ships they bring to our waters. The negotiation deteriorates rapidly from there, moving through the predictable stages of diplomatic breakdown, formal protests, veiled threats, explicit threats, and finally the kind of mutual posturing that makes armed conflict inevitable. You watch this process unfold with growing unease because you can see exactly where it's heading. The attack begins at dawn, because dawn attacks are traditional in Bronze Age warfare, and tradition matters when you're trying to maintain proper heroic form. You do your best to stay away from King Tenes himself, focusing your attention on the ordinary soldiers who presumably don't have divine relatives who might take their deaths personally. It's a reasonable strategy that works perfectly, until the moment when battlefield chaos makes reasonable strategies impossible to maintain. The problem with melee combat is that it's fundamentally unpredictable. That moment arrives when Tenes, leading a desperate counterattack designed to break the Greek advance, finds himself directly in your path. You recognize him immediately. The golden hair, the divine bearing, the exact person your mother warned you not to harm under any circumstances. He's wounded already, bleeding from a cut across his sword arm, but still fighting with the desperate courage of someone defending his home. For a heartbeat, you consider your options. But then Tenes attacks you directly, his blade aimed at your heart with the kind of precision that suggests divine training. And suddenly, you're fighting for your life against someone you're not supposed to kill. The combat is brief but intense. Tenes is skilled, better than skilled actually, with the kind of technique that comes from being trained by immortal tutors. But skill, even divine-enhanced skill, isn't enough to overcome the kind of supernatural advantages that come with being dipped in the river Styx. Your spear finds him almost by accident, a thrust meant to disarm that goes slightly off tangle and penetrates deeper than intended. Bronze pierces flesh, divine ichor mingles with mortal blood, and King Tenes of Tenedos collapses with the kind of surprised expression that suggests he'd expected his divine heritage to protect him better than it actually did. For a moment, the battle pauses around you. Even in the chaos of combat, the death of a king tends to create a pocket of stillness, a moment when everyone processes what has just happened and considers its implications. Apollo's displeasure, when it manifests, doesn't come with lightning bolts or dramatic pronouncements. Instead, it settles over you like a shadow, a weight that you can feel but can't quite define. The god of music and prophecy and divine retribution has marked you for attention and not the good kind. You don't need an oracle to tell you that killing Apollo's grandson was a mistake that will have consequences. The only questions are when those consequences will manifest and what form they'll take. Sometimes you catch yourself touching the spot on your heel where your mother's fingers once gripped you, the one vulnerable place on your otherwise invulnerable body, and wondering if divine revenge might find even the smallest weaknesses. Standing on the beach of Tenedos, watching your men secure the island that you've just conquered through another act of accidental violence, you reflect on the growing pattern in your heroic career. Every victory seems to come with unintended costs. Every battle leaves you with new obligations, new enemies, new complications that will require future attention. Because nothing says following divine instructions like doing exactly the opposite of what your goddess mother explicitly told you not to do. At this rate, you'll have the entire Olympic pantheon personally invested in your destruction before you even reach Troy. The conquest of Tenedos is complete by midday, which is efficient even by the standards of Bronze Age military operations. The island's defences, while brave, were never designed to withstand a siege by the entire Greek expeditionary force. What resistance remained after Tenedos' death crumbles quickly, and by afternoon your army is busy dividing spoils and planning the next phase of their campaign. You should feel triumphant, another victory, another demonstration of Greek military superiority, another step closer to the walls of Troy. Instead, you feel like someone who's just stepped on a cosmic landmine and is waiting to see how large the explosion will be. Apollo's displeasure hangs over you like storm clouds on the horizon, not immediately threatening, but definitely promising future unpleasantness. Divine anger doesn't typically manifest itself right away. The gods prefer to let their victims worry about when retribution will arrive and what form it will take. It's psychological warfare on a cosmic scale, and it's remarkably effective. The army doesn't seem to notice your growing unease. They're too busy celebrating another successful conquest and preparing for the main event that everyone came here to accomplish. Troy lies just beyond the horizon now, close enough that lookouts can make out the famous walls when the weather is clear. After months of preparation, false starts and accidental detours, the moment everyone has been waiting for is finally at hand. Patroclus finds you standing at the edge of the camp, staring out at the darkening sea, with the expression of someone contemplating mortality and finding it wanting. You look like a man who's just realized he's made a terrible mistake, he observes, settling down beside you with the easy familiarity that's developed between you over the past weeks. There's something about the way he says it, not mocking, not worried, just gently observant, that makes you think about how few people in your life have ever spoken to you without calculation. Not as the son of Thetis, not as the prophesized hero, just as yourself. Several terrible mistakes, actually, you reply, because honesty seems appropriate when discussing your rapidly expanding collection of divine grudges. I'm starting to think that being legendary isn't quite the blessing everyone makes it out to be. Too many gods taking personal interest in your career. Something like that, you gesture vaguely toward the conquered island behind you. I was specifically warned not to kill King Tenes. Guess how well I followed those instructions. Patroclus considers this information with the thoughtful expression of someone who's had enough experience with divine politics to understand the implications. Apollo's grandson? Perot's grandson. Ah! He's quiet for a moment, processing the significance of your latest theological misstep. Well, at least you're consistent. Most heroes only anger one or two gods during their entire careers. You seem determined to achieve comprehensive divine disapproval. It's meant to be reassuring, but it's not particularly successful in that regard. There's something deeply unsettling about accumulating enemies among beings who control fundamental forces of nature and have unlimited time to plan elaborate revenge schemes. The prophecy said I'd have a short life, you muse, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. I'm beginning to understand why. Prophecies have a way of being self-fulfilling, Patroclus agrees. Especially when the people they're about keep doing things that make them come true faster. It's an astute observation, and it makes you think about the patterns that have emerged in your life so far. It's almost as if fate operates on principles of ironic inevitability, ensuring that every attempt to avoid your destiny only brings you closer to it. Do you think, you ask Patroclus, that free will is real, or just something we tell ourselves to make predestination easier to bear? I think, he replies after considering the question seriously, that the answer to that question probably depends on whether you're a god or a mortal. The gods seem to know how everything will turn out. We just have to live through it and hope for the best. It's a pragmatic philosophy, and probably the healthiest way to approach existence when you're caught up in cosmic forces beyond your control. But there's something profoundly unsatisfying about accepting that your entire life is essentially a script written by divine authors who don't seem particularly concerned with your personal happiness. The next morning brings news that puts your philosophical concerns into perspective. Troy is visible from the masthead of the lead ships, and the fleet will reach the Trojan coast within days. The announcement transforms the entire army. Months of preparation, weeks of sailing, countless small battles and diplomatic complications have all been leading to this moment. The greatest fortress in the world waits just beyond the horizon, and every man in the expeditionary force knows that what happens there will determine whether their names are remembered in glory or forgotten in failure. You should be excited. This is what you were born for, trained for, prophesied to accomplish. The war that will define your generation is about to begin, and you're positioned to play the central role in events that will echo through history. Instead, you find yourself thinking about Scyros, about Didomia and Neoptolemus, about the peaceful life you abandoned to be here, about the choices you've made and the ones that have been made for you, about the growing weight of divine attention and what it might cost you in the end. The Trojan coast, when it finally appears, is everything the stories claimed it would be. The city rises from the plain like a mountain made of human ambition, its walls gleaming white in the morning sun, its towers reaching toward the sky with the kind of architectural confidence that comes from centuries of prosperity and security. It's beautiful in its way. It's also the most formidable military target you've ever seen. The walls alone are enough to give any reasonable commander pause. They're massive, well-maintained, and designed by people who understood that someday someone would try very hard to knock them down. The gates are positioned to create killing fields for defenders, the towers are spaced to provide overlapping fields of fire, and the whole structure radiates the kind of professional competence that suggests this siege will not be brief. Behind those walls live the people you've come to fight. Prince Hector, whose reputation for martial prowess rivals your own. King Priam, whose wisdom and dignity are legendary throughout the known world. Paris, whose romantic decisions started this entire conflict, and countless others. Warriors, citizens, families, who've done nothing more than have the misfortune to live in a city that someone else has decided to conquer. For the first time since this whole enterprise began, you find yourself wondering whether this war is actually worth fighting. But such doubts are luxury items that heroes can't afford to keep. The die has been cast, the ships have sailed, the prophecies have been spoken. Whether this conflict is wise or foolish, justified or catastrophic, is no longer your decision to make. The landing, when it comes, is unopposed. The Trojans, it seems, have decided to let the Greeks establish their beachhead rather than contest every foot of sand in preliminary skirmishes. It's a sound strategic decision that suggests their commanders understand the value of choosing when and where to fight. Your first steps on Trojan soil feel significant in ways that previous landings haven't. This isn't another accidental invasion or diplomatic misunderstanding. This is the beginning of the war that everyone has been preparing for. The conflict that will determine the fate of kings and the future of nations. The army that follows you ashore is the finest force ever assembled. Thousands of professional soldiers, dozens of legendary heroes, equipment and supplies sufficient to maintain a siege for years if necessary. If Troy can be challenged by force, this is the force that will challenge it. But looking up at those impossible walls, feeling the weight of accumulated divine displeasure pressing down on your shoulders, you wonder about the challenges ahead. The city has never yielded to foreign pressure, never bent to outside threats, never shown any inclination to surrender when challenged. And you're beginning to suspect that the gods have their own plans for how this war will unfold, plans that may not align with anyone's expectations of swift resolution. The sun sets on your first day in the shadow of Troy, painting the famous walls in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow will bring the beginning of siege operations, the start of what promises to be a long and complicated conflict. Tonight, You sit by your campfire and think about prophecies, about the short, glorious life you've been promised, about the divine enemies you've accumulated and the prices they'll eventually demand, about the war that's just beginning and the feeling that everything up to this point has been merely preparation for whatever comes next, about the strange certainty that some friendships matter more than others, though you can't yet say why. The thought of anything happening to Patroclus makes your chest tighten with an inexplicable dread. Tonight, you're finally where fate has always intended you to be, camped outside the walls of Troy, sharpening your weapons and waiting to discover what challenges lie ahead. The coming war is about to begin, because nothing says this will end well like starting the greatest war in history while carrying personal grudges from multiple Olympic deities. But that's tomorrow's problem. Tonight, you're exactly where you're supposed to be, and that will have to be enough. Thank you for joining us for another installment of Achilles' Journey, where divine warnings are treated as suggestions and friendly fire incidents are just Tuesday. Sweet dreams, and remember, sometimes the best way to follow destiny is to accidentally stumble toward it while trying to avoid it entirely.